So let's give this conference a real start with Professor Levine keynote address, and Professor Levine will be introduced by a ULB professor, Professor Georg Kirchsteiger.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Georg Kirchsteiger. I'm professor here at ULB, and it's a great honor to introduce one of the most eminent researchers in economic theory of our times, namely David Levine. David has received his PhD from MIT. He moved then to UCLA, where he spent 20-something years before moving to St. Louis, Washington University, and since 2013 he has been at EUI in Florence. When I checked yesterday his CV again, I had checked it before quite some times, but to prepare for this introduction, I checked it, of course, again. I was again more than impressed by the number of publications in top 5 journals he has. That is really, really impressive. I would be happy if I had only a small percentage of them, to be honest. And also the very large number of citations, more than 20,000, which shows how important his contributions are. And it's also very impressive with the range of topics on which David has worked. He has worked on for example, on the impact of market structure on the innovation and growth. And he came to a very clear conclusion, which is summarized by the title of his book in this field, namely Against Intellectual Monopoly, which clearly states what he says. He also has done very, very important work in game theory. Maybe this is where most of you know him, of the theory people among you at least. He has worked on repeated games, provided some very important folk theorems on that topic. He has worked on their interaction between long-term and short-term players within repeated games. And he has also done some seminal work on the theory of learning in games. Again, this is the title of this book, which still is the reference in that field. And finally, and for me personally the closest, is his work on behavioral economics, where he wrote on such different topics like dual selves or model of altruism and spitefulness. And also he has worked a lot, and I think still is working a lot, on endogenous social norms and preferences. Well, without any further ado, David, the floor is yours. Thanks for coming.
Okay. Is it working?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Keep track of the tanks. Okay. Let me start by thanking everybody for being here and thanking the organizing committee for organizing this. I think at the end of this, I'm supposed to give a few remarks about careers and advice for young economists. And one of the things I'm going to say, just to foreshadow this, is that conferences like this are very important. And the willingness of people to contribute to the public good of organizing these things. I've organized conferences. I know how much work is involved. The willingness of people to contribute to this public good is actually very important for your individual careers and for the health of the profession. So I really, from my heart, would like to thank the people that arranged this conference, and also as well for inviting me. Okay. So I'm going to talk first about work I've been doing recently on reputation, which is a topic that I did originally quite a long time ago, but I've just recently come back to. And then at the end, I will have a few remarks about about the sort of career issues and so forth. I encourage people to ask questions as we go along. Okay, I'm going to talk about the reputation trap. I'm going to start with a quotation. The attribution of this quotation is actually somewhat uncertain. It seems to be attributed to Benjamin Franklin, but I'm not entirely sure that that's true. It is, glass, china, and reputation are easily cracked and never well mended. So there's a basic, for a long time in reputation theory, maybe other people here are somewhat familiar with that literature. A basic characteristic of the bulk of the models in this area are that they're symmetric between having a reputation and not having a reputation. That is, a reputation is just as easy to lose as it is to acquire. And that's something we don't believe in practice is true. And let me indicate why I think that this is the case. Think in terms of a reputation for square dealing, of treating other people well, treating customers fairly, right? If you have a good reputation, people will be eager to do business with you. Fine, then they'll see whether you're what you say you are or not. If you have a bad reputation, nobody's going to be in a rush to come and buy at your shop. And therefore, even if you have very high quality merchandise and provide very good service, nobody will know because nobody comes. I should say that the model I'm going to talk about today is actually the second model I know of. This tries to model this asymmetry. There's a much, much earlier paper by Guillermo Ordonez, who's actually at the rather different, his paper goes in a rather different direction, so I won't talk about it. But I will mention that I'm quite certain that he and I talked about this idea many, many years ago. He's probably the one, I'm sure that germ has been sitting in my head for several decades since we originally talked about it. Okay, so I want to actually talk primarily about the consequences of a model in which reputation is easy to lose but hard to gain. The point that I want to make is that in such a world, history matters in a very strong way. Why is that? So I want to think of two kinds of things. There's sort of adverse events that destroy your reputation and beneficial events that lead to a good reputation. So I want to ask what happens after a good event, beneficial event. Okay. So for some reason, you have been gifted with a good reputation through this beneficial event. Now, whatever it was, antecedent circumstance that led to this, you're now a perfectly ordinary guy, and you think, what should I do next? And what you think, of course, is, gosh, I've got this great reputation, I better protect it. If I do anything, I've got all the customers, everybody's coming to my store, I better be good, because if I'm not, everybody finds out and I'm dead. Okay? So once you get the good reputation, you have every incentive in the world to keep it. Now, take the one who has the adverse event. My reputation has been destroyed. So what do I do? What do I do next? Well, I raised myself, geez, it's going to be pretty hard. It's going to be pretty hard to get this reputation back. There's only a few people coming into my store. I might as well cheat them, right? I might as well cheat them because if I'm good to them, nobody's ever going to find out anyway, right? And so now I'm sort of stuck in this trap. This is what I refer to as a reputation trap. I'm stuck in this trap where it's perfectly rational for me to cheat my customers because it would be difficult to get a reputation. And so now I'm just sort of stuck there until maybe some lucky event comes along and restores my reputation. So what we see is that otherwise identical individuals, right? They're the same in all respects except something happened in the distant past. One of them had a good event in the distant past, and one of them had this bad event in the distant past. And one lives a life of thriving business and good income and happiness and wealth, and the other's stuck in this trap of poverty, bad reputation, few customers, low income. Okay? And yet the only difference is something happened long, long ago. And this is a model without capital. It's not that one acquired capital. It's just purely a reputational effect. Okay, so there was a particular motivation I had for being interested in this, and it has to do with a question about something I've been interested in for a while, which is political economy and social norms, and that's the issue of the persistence of dysfunctional cultures, right? So we observe that on the one hand, cultures persist for a very long time, even if they don't seem to work very well. And so we have, for example, natural experiments where we have one thing that happens to one village and something that happens to an adjoining village. And we observe 150 years later, there's still 20% income differential between these different villages. These are just some numbers from empirical studies. Asamoah and Robinson argued about a 400-year, 4th-century persistence. Bignone et al., that's probably the weakest in terms of evidence, 9 centuries. And I think the one that has the best, okay. I guess the pointer doesn't work. Dell and Rubin, who have the strongest evidence, have evidence for about 150 years of persistence. Now, side by side with this, how did these cultures get to be the way they were in the first place? It seems that cultures can actually change very rapidly when circumstances warrant. It seems like there's sort of this stickiness in culture, and yet there isn't really. If we look at cultural change, look at religious change. In 1 decade in Ireland, the country went from being essentially entirely Catholic to being almost entirely secular. That's a pretty big change. Language. So you think language is very difficult to change. In 15 years, I think it is, the number of Hebrew speakers in the world grew from basically 0 to, what does it say there, 30,000? That's a lot of people changing their language, right? Economic culture. So these are sort of, maybe for us economists, less interesting, religion and language, economic culture. And so, we ask, why don't the Nigerians, who have this apparently rather bad economic culture, why don't they become more like the Japanese, who seem to have a very good economic culture? And, maybe it's just too hard, okay? Maybe it's very costly to make that change. But yet, if you ask how the Japanese became the Japanese in the first place, right, what you discover is that in the 1860s, they were basically the equivalent of the West in the 1300s. A very medieval culture. They had castles. They fought with swords. They were knights. They had no technology and so forth. And what you find is 30 years later, they're an industrial society, and the whole scale changed the culture. So if you look at pictures of what Japanese people wore, right? You see them wearing these sort of traditional Japanese garments in 1868. In 1903, they're wearing Western suits with little ties, right? Everything about the culture changed. Okay, so it doesn't seem that difficult, not over 5 years maybe, or even 10 years, but over much shorter periods than 100 years to change an entire culture. Okay, so I think there's lots of reasons why cultural change is both sticky and can change rapidly. I should just say the most obvious thing is a model of adjustment cost. If there's a fixed cost, which you think there would be in changing your culture, then if the incentive to change is strong, you would overcome that cost, right? But if the incentive is weak, then you wouldn't bother. So you could see persistence if the gap wasn't too big, but then you'd see a big change if the gap grew too large.
But doesn't it make a big difference what those who are in power in the respective country want? I mean, if you take Nigeria, in Nigeria, those who rule actually benefit from this very dysfunctional economic culture. Whereas in the Meiji period of Japan, those who ruled, essentially the emperor and his clique wanted this change and to some extent enforced it.
Well, we could debate this at some length, but I'll just point out two mitigating things. The first is that it's not clearly to the advantage of the people on top in Nigeria or Latin America would be another example. So if you compared the wealth of people like Bill Gates who to the wealth of the top people in Nigeria, you'd find that people do very well in relatively good cultures. So the possibility of making money is much greater in a more thriving, dynamic culture than it is stealing the pittances that are available. The other thing is, what you say about Japan, I wouldn't really agree with. That is, the people that wanted the change overthrew the existing power structure, and in fact, Japan was ruled by feudal lords who certainly did not want this change. So the issue there, I'm thinking in terms of a model of some kind of collective decision making. I agree there could be issues there, but I think in practice they're often overcome. Anyway, this, in some sense, not what the not the central point of this paper. I don't want to argue that the only reason that there isn't change is because of reputation, but I want to argue that might be an important part of the picture for this persistence. That is, if the treatment of foreigners and foreign investors is an important ingredient in economic success, right? So you have to draw people from the outside to have a thriving economy. Then we have the possibility of a reputation trap. Because if you have a reputation for cheating foreign investors, you're not likely to get a lot of foreign investment. And therefore, the incentive to treat what few foreign investors come is relatively low. Okay, so I see here a potential explanation in terms of reputation trap. What the paper is actually about is a theory of what the reputation trap is like, so we can start thinking about questions such as, if it is a problem, what could we do about it? All right, so from this introduction, I don't actually want to get in a long discussion of the introduction. Hopefully it's just to get you somewhat interested in the topic and the theory. So I'm going to talk now more into the details of the model, and here you should definitely feel free to stop me if you have questions. This model draws on a lot of strands of the reputational literature. If you know the reputational literature, you know that there's several different divisions. There's the Gang of Four, the more traditional reputation theory. There's a more recent Samuelson reputation theory, and so forth and so on. I draw from both of these threads. And so the model formally is going to be a model of overlapping generations of finitely lived players. Now, as in all reputation models, there's going to be an asymmetry between a long-run player who establishes a reputation and the short-run players who here you might want to think of as the customers of the store. So there are two player roles. Player one is the long-run player, so we think of player one as living a long time. Player two is actually, we think of it as a representative of a mass of short-term players. So a representative consumer that comes and buys from the store, or investors who invest in this country. They each live for a single period. That just sort of identifies what the period is. And in each period, they play a stage game. This is a simultaneous move game, at least in the sense that the short-run player is going to have to move without knowing what the long-run player did. So the long-run player has to make an investment decision, to invest or not to invest. It's costly to invest. So AI is the investment decision. The cost of investment is C times AI. So you pay 0 if you don't invest, and you pay C if you do invest. And the short-run player who does not observe the investment choice has to decide whether to enter or to stay out, whether to buy or not to buy. Or you might think of it as, enter a lot or enter a little if you prefer. So a short-run player payoffs are very simple. If you stay out, you get nothing. If you enter and there's no investment, so the point is you only want to enter if they're investing, right? If there's a good product, you want to enter. If it's some terrible product, you prefer not to. So if there was no investment, you get negative payoff for entering. And if their investment has been made, you get a positive payoff for investing. And I've normalized the things here, but that doesn't much matter. Now, as is typically the case in reputation models, we're going to have different types of long-run player, and inferences about these types by the short-run player is what's going to drive the reputational aspect of the model. And I'm going to have two different types. So there's the Gang of Four type, which is the good type. And so in the Gang of Four original research, the idea is you want to build a reputation by imitating the good type. And there's also going to be a bad type, which is going to be the Malus-Samuelson type. So Malus-Samuelson, what you want to do is avoid being mistaken for the bad type. And you'll see why I want to have both types in just a bit. And I'm going to think of the good type as being a beneficial event. So these types, the good and the bad types are what are called behavioral types. They just do what they do. Good types always invest. Bad types never invest. So the arrival of a good type is a beneficial event. They're going to invest, thereby enabling you potentially be thought of as having a good reputation. A bad type is an adverse event in the sense they never invest, so you're going to get caught out and you're going to be thought to have a bad reputation. And there'll be the normal type. The normal type has payoffs that consist of two parts. One is paying the cost of investment, and the other depends upon whether or not the short-run player enters. So you get 1 if the short-run player enters, 0 if the short-run player doesn't enter. So you want the short-run player to enter, but you don't actually want to invest. That's the basic conflict in the model. And these player types are going to stay fixed during the lifetime of the players, but they can change when the players are replaced. So these players, the long-run player in particular, has a stochastic life. When that long-run player dies, it's replaced by another long-run player. At that particular time, the type of long-run player can change. And players care only about the expected average utility during their lifetime. I'm not going to have separate discounting. The discounting is to be incorporated in the fact that players have a probability, longer players have a probability of dying every period. That will induce effectively discounting into the model. Okay, that's the basic setup. Questions so far? Yeah?
Always invest in the bad or never invest in the bad. Endogenous in the model because
No, it's exogenous. It can be made. I don't spend much time on this because it's a big component of the literature on reputation. One can say that they have preferences so that it's a dominant strategy for them to behave this way. Okay. So, but it's also we can do what I guess the approach that was taken by Milgram and Roberts was to just say, fine, it's the only thing that they can do. Okay, but there's a big literature on this. I don't want to go into that, but this is sort of a typical way of doing things. There's nothing innovative there. Okay, the life of the long-run player, as I said, is stochastic with probability delta, which is because that's the discount factor. With probability delta, you get to go for another period. With probability 1 minus delta, you're replaced. When you're replaced, as I said, the type can change. This is basically Maliff and Samuelson at this point. When you're replaced, the type can change. The probability of type tau is replaced by a different type, is of the following sort. It's given by some constant, which is transitional, Q of t and sigma. 1 minus delta is a normalizing factor, so certain formulas look better later on. The important thing here is epsilon. Epsilon is supposed to be a small number. Why? Because I want each type to live for a long time. I want the long-run player to actually be long-run. Okay, so this corresponds, for example, so it means that if you replace, you're most likely replaced by another type. This is needed to make reputation work. If there's not enough persistence in your type, then the short-run player can conclude very little about what you're likely to be next period.
If, let's say, a bad type gets replaced, does it get replaced by a good type, or does it replace?
It can be either one. So Q of tau and sigma, the assumption is it's positive. So here, the bad type could be replaced by either a good type or a normal type. It's not, the model's actually not that sensitive to it. The important thing is you got to be able to move through all the different possible types. If there's some type you can't get to, that would be problematic. Okay, so types being persistent means epsilon small. And I'll say exactly how small in just a bit. That's an interesting noise. Is this something to do with me?
Don't worry.
Okay. So I also need to talk about the information technology because, as I said, we want a situation where, if you have customers, you're more likely to be observed what your investment is than if you don't have customers.
It's at the end of the real, I don't know.
Okay, it's very persistent though. Okay, so at the beginning of each period, I'm going to assume that everybody observes a public signal Z of what happened in the previous period. So there's a relatively short-term information here. And so there's two possibilities. If entry took place last period, everybody sees what the long-run player did. So the signal is equal to 0 if the long-run player didn't invest last period, and 1 if the long-run player did invest last period. So you learn right away if the entrant enters last period, you observe right away. Okay. The difference is going to be if there was no entry last period. So if the short-run player stayed out last period, there's still a chance that you can learn what happened, but the chance is much lower. So there's actually 3 signals with probability pi. Okay, you get to see what happened last period. So probability pi, you see whether the long-run player invested or not. And with probability 1 minus pi, you just get a signal saying nothing. Don't know what happened, okay? A very simple signal technology, but the critical thing is it's asymmetric. You learn more quickly if the entrant enters than if the entrant stays out, okay? And pi is a measure. If pi is equal to 1, right, that's the standard model. If pi is equal to 1, you learn equally quickly in both cases. If pi is very close to 0, you learn very slowly when the entrant stays out. Okay, that actually completes the description of the model. I now need to tell you about strategies and the notion of equilibrium. So, strategies. first thing I want to say is that players are only aware of events that occur during their lifetime. So a short-run player in particular doesn't know the whole history of signals, just the signal that they received themselves from last period. Long-run player lives longer, so the long-run player knows the whole history of signals while they're alive, but I don't assume the long-run player knows about signals received by earlier generations of long-run players. Here's actually very important. Here's actually really, in some sense, the key assumption. I'm going to assume that the short-run players can't mix, that the short-run player plays pure strategies. Okay, so I'm going to prove a uniqueness result. So one statement of the uniqueness result is there is a unique pure strategy equilibrium, and there might also be mixed strategy equilibrium. I'm going to come back to this. Okay, but for the moment, I'm just going to say the short-run player can't mix. And as it turns out, the short-run player can't mix. It turns out the long-run player doesn't want to mix. So it actually ensures that the equilibrium is going to be in pure strategies. But anyway, so short-run player here is very simple, right? There's 3 possible signals, 0, 1, or no signal. And based on that, either you do 0, which is stay out, or you do 1, which stays in. So that means there's what? There's 2 times 2 times 2, 8 strategies for the short-run player. So a relatively small number of strategies. Now, long-run player is a much more complicated strategy space because it observes finite histories, but of potentially unbounded length, and from a map of all that history, they can choose to mix in a particular way. Fortunately, it turns out they don't want to use most of those strategies. But a strategy for the long-run player is a probability of investment based on the history of signals that long-run player has seen. And also of whether the short-run player entered or not, because the long-run player knows that as well. Okay, now, here's the second key assumption. I want to assume that names and calendar time don't matter. That we think of this as kind of it's going on for a long time. It's been going, you don't really know how long it was, 1,000 years, 200 years since the game started. You don't really know, you can't really base your strategy on the fact that my name is David rather than John. What does that mean? It means what I refer to as common strategies. All short-run players use exactly the same strategy. They use the same map from signals to actions. And the same thing for the long-run player. The long-run player has lots of strategies, but all long-run players use the same strategies. Okay? Now, we're going to have to specify, this is by the way similar to but a little different than Markov perfection, because it actually allows players to have a lot more information that they can base their decisions on than Markov perfection would allow, but it has an element of Markov perfection in it. So it's kind of a stationarity assumption. All right. I'm going to make one other assumption. I'll put that up there for you to enjoy staring at just for a minute. There is this cost C, which is the cost of investment. I'm going to rule out 3 different values of C. I'm going to say that whatever C is, it's not one of those 3 values. And the reason for that is it avoids ties that make life a nightmare, and it's a pretty weak assumption. Okay, now, in order to talk about optimization by the players, I want an equilibrium in which players optimize, I have to say something about what their beliefs are like. Okay, and that's a little tricky. So it's easy for the long-run player, because the long-run player is supposed to know the strategy of the short-run player. If the long-run player knows the strategy of the short-run player, it's quite easy for the long-run player to work out what's an optimal. Just face a simple dynamic programming problem, which I'll actually show you in just a moment. Okay, so actually the optimization problem faced by the long-run player depends depends only on what the short-run player does, right? So if you think the short-run player is going to enter, you play one way. If you think the short-run player is not going to enter, you play another way. Okay, and so V of alpha 2 denotes the expected average value of the utility for the long-run player. That'll come up in just a bit. Oh, I say I do this in 2 steps. Okay, so I guess I'm going to describe the long-run player first, and then I'll come to the short-run player. So the long-run player faces a simple dynamic programming problem. Your first period utility is A2 minus CA1. This is for the normal long-run player. I don't have to worry about what the behavioral type is going to do, because they're just going to do what they do. So probability delta of the gain continues, and depending on whether there was entry or not and what action you chose, that determines the probability of the next signal. So the probability of getting the signal 1, given Z in 1, is equal to what? So let me describe this first one. Probability of 1. This is a probability of getting the good signal, given that you took the good action. Okay. And so what is that equal to? So Z is the initial, is the beginning of period signal. We're talking about the probability of the beginning of next period signal being 1. Okay, so there's two things. Alpha 2 of z is the probability that the short-run player enters. If the short-run player enters and you play to good action with probability 1, you get a good signal. Okay, so that's alpha 2 equals 1, and then the second term doesn't matter. If alpha 2 is equal to 0, then we have only the second term, and that says there's now a probability pi that what you did is revealed, and what you did was to choose 1, so you'll get the signal 1. Okay. Now the probability of the neutral signal is what? The neutral signal can only occur if the short-run player didn't enter, okay, in which case the probability is 1 minus pi of getting the neutral signal. So this is the signaling updating technology based on the signal. And so the Bellman equation looks like this. It looks like this is average present value, 1 minus delta times your current payoff, which is A2 minus CA1, plus delta, which is a continuation probability, times the sum over next period states of the transition probability from the current state z to the next z prime, times v of what action will be chosen by the short-run player's strategy given that the signal is going to be z prime next period. That's the Bellman equation. Does that seem clear to everybody? Okay. All right. So that's the Bellman equation. If epsilon is small, this problem has a unique solution. Because this problem, so in a Markov decision problem, if the solution is unique, it has to have what's called the strong Markov property. The strong Markov property is that the optimal action depends only on the signal. So just like while the long-run player can choose many strategies, the only optimal strategy for the long-run player is similar to the short-run player, which is play a pure strategy, which is to pick an action just based on the signal. So we now know that A1, I think it's on the next slide, that A1 is not a number between 0 and 1. It is a number that is either 0 or 1, and it doesn't depend on all of H. It depends only on Z. Now, the generic cost assumption came into this because if generic cost fails, then there could be ties, and when there's ties in a Markov decision problem, there are solutions that don't have to be strong Markov. Okay, so now we're in a pretty simple world. I'm going to focus on defining equilibrium in the simple world because I'm going to talk now about short-run player optimality. So both the long run and the short-run player are simply picking actions based on the signal. Right? So there are, what did I say, 8 strategies for the short-run player, so there must also be 8 strategies for long-run player. So there's actually only 64 different combinations of strategies by the two players. Not that I'm going to try to write down a 64 by 64 matrix, but that's neither here nor there. The point is this: the joint distributions of types and signals. So for any given starting point, I can run, given the strategy of the players, I can run this process forward in time. It's now a Markov process because there's transition probabilities, okay? And since the joint distribution of types and signals has a probability distribution, it depends on the initial condition, it depends on how long the process has been running, and I made enough assumptions, namely that the Q's were positive, that this converges to unique ergodic probability distributions. Acyclic, okay, you can reach every state from any other state with positive probability. There's one exception to this. If the short-run player always enters, then there can't possibly be the signal n. So that would be a transitory state. We have to throw out that state, but that's not really very important. So the beliefs, whatever you thought originally, whatever was the initial condition, over a long period of time, mu zt would converge to the unique limit, right, mu sub z tau. I'm going to take that to be the beliefs of the short-run player. That is, the short-run player knows basically the process is ergodic, knows the strategies, knows the process has been running for a long time, but not exactly how long, and says, aha, I think it should be the ergodic distribution that I'm seeing, because that's really the only information that I have. So those are the beliefs of the short-run player. Now notice that there's two things. It's a joint distribution over both signals and types. Now, the ergodic distribution over types doesn't depend in any way on the signals, right? Types just move exogenous. It's type a long-run player. They're just fixed transition probabilities. So I can work out separately mu sub tau. I don't need to worry about the z's in that. But I need to know the strategies in order to work out the joint distribution. In a sense, what the short-run player is really interested in is what is the distribution of tau conditional on z? What the short-run player wants to know is, given the signal I saw, how likely is it that the long-run player is a particular type, and therefore what's the long-run player actually going to do? Are they going to invest or not? And so should I enter or not? Okay. But there's enough information, mu z tau, that we can use Bayes' law to figure out what that is. Okay. So short-run player beliefs are that it's the ergodic distribution. So now I can define equilibrium. It consists of pure strategies by each player, which are functions of the signal. These strategies generate unique ergodic distribution mu z tau. And the long-run player has to play a best response to the short-run player's strategy, and the short-run player has to play a best response to the ergodic beliefs and the signal. So I get a signal n. I have to make some inference from the signal n. How likely is it that I'm facing a normal type? How likely is it that I'm facing a good type? How likely is it that I'm facing a bad type? And I reach that inference based on the ergodic distribution. Now, domain theorem. How am I should be, keep my case around the clock here. Oh, I'm very good on time. I have all the way till 11, right? Okay, good. Lots of time. All right, main theorem. So, V, let me remind you what V is. V is how much the short-run player likes to enter when there's investment. Q are the transition probabilities for the long-run player. So we're fixing those two parameters. And then I'm going to say for small enough epsilon, so there's some epsilon lower bar bigger than 0. And if epsilon is smaller than epsilon lower bar times the minimum of pi and 1 minus pi. So pi and 1 minus pi is obviously the biggest when pi is a half. As pi goes to either endpoint, pi is either close to 0 or pi is close to 1, this bound on epsilon gets tighter and tighter. Okay? I think it's useful to see exactly how the bound depends upon pi. There is a unique equilibrium. That's the theorem. Okay? It's a strict equilibrium. That is, each player strictly prefers to be using the strategy they're using to any other strategy. So, so lots of equilibria involve indifference. These do not. Okay? Preferences are strict. And in all of these, in these equilibria, the short-run player enters only on the good signal. So the short-run player enters if the signal's good, stays out if the signal is bad, and also stays out if the signal is neutral. Okay? And there are 3 different types of equilibria, but they're mutually exclusive. They depend upon, so they differ in what the long-run player does. Okay? And they're mutually exclusive. Which one is the case depends upon the parameters of the preferences of the long-run player and pi, the information technology. So they depend on delta and pi, and this says what it is. It says if delta is less than c, so if the discount factor is too low, then the long-run player never invests. So long-run player, this is all for the normal. The normal long-run player never invests. The good type obviously does invest. So the short-run player enters on a good signal. The only way there could be a good signal here is if there was a good type, because the normal and the bad type of long-run player never invest. So you see a good signal, you know you're facing the good type, so definitely, right, it's very unlikely the type is going to change in one period, so therefore you should definitely enter. As soon as you see a bad signal, you start staying out. Okay. Case 2. So now suppose delta is bigger than c. Suppose that the long-run player is patient enough that they're actually willing to incur the cost of maintaining a reputation. There's now 2 subcases. And these cases depend upon whether pi is large or whether pi is small. So I'm going to do the case 3 first, if pi is large. So pi is large is kind of the familiar reputation case. It says that information gets out pretty quickly. Okay, it says that the information rate at the bad state is about the same as at the good state. When pi is equal to 1, that would be the standard reputation case. So if pi is bigger than some number, which depends on the discount factor and the cost, then the long-run player always invests. Okay, even in the bad state, even if you have a bad reputation, invest. The case I'm going to be most interested in is case 2. This is for smaller values of pi. So now the information leaks out rather slowly in the bad state. Then the long-run player invests only on the good signal. So the long-run player invests on the good signal, but doesn't invest on the bad signal. And all the bad, no, these are all strict inequalities, and the weak inequalities can't occur because I made a generic assumption about C that just said forget about those. Okay. I'm going to talk some about this theorem, but other questions. So this is the model, this is the theorem, and the rest is just talk. Any questions before that? Yeah, I see.
Is there any interpretation of these right-hander? Like, what is your interpretation of this? Like,
Of the theorem? Of
the right-hander phi lower relative to that term, C minus delta C divided by delta. Do you have any interpretation? You just say it's...
Yeah, so interpretation, okay, I see your question, yeah. So there's this threshold for pi. And you want to know, what is this threshold for pi? So the way to understand the threshold for pi is to understand how it depends on delta and C. Okay, so I can tell you that the bigger is delta, the smaller is that threshold. I'm pretty sure that that comes out of that equation, right? Because the delta in the denominator goes up faster somehow than the delta, right? That will go the same way. And so the other thing is that, what is it? The bigger is C. Which way does that go? Should go the other way. So the bigger is delta, the smaller is the threshold, the bigger is C, the smaller should be the threshold, right? Well, I don't know what you mean by interpretation.
Like an implicit one, like I don't know.
Well, it does in the sense that it solves a very specific equation, which I'll show you in just a minute. But I think in terms of economic interpretation, it's really the dependence on C and delta that's interesting. How does the threshold go up and down with C and delta? There's, of course, another interpretation, which is it's a solution of a particular equation, which you'll see in just a minute. And the equation has an interpretation as well. Okay. So I want to talk through the intuition of this equilibrium. I'm not going to try to do the proof. The hard part of the proof, by the way, involves doing computations involving the ergodic distribution. The computation is the long-run player. So showing that it's unique is the hard part. Showing that these things are in equilibrium is actually pretty easy. Okay. So the assumption epsilon is small means that types are highly persistent. So the short-run type basically doesn't worry about the type changes. So the short-run player draws an inference about your current type based upon what the signal was, and then there's a chance that the type changes, but that probability of the type changing is really quite small. So basically, they think that you're the same type that you were before. Okay. So what does the signal 0 indicate? A 0, so you're a short-run player. What should you think if you see the signal 0? So it means either you're facing a bad type, or the normal type is not investing, and you're facing a normal type. But in either case, what do you expect to happen next? You don't expect the type to change. If you're facing a bad type, you'll face a bad type again, and they won't invest. If you're facing a normal type that's not investing, you'll face a normal type that doesn't invest again. So if you see a bad signal, then you expect no investment next period as well. So you'd be a fool to enter. Okay? Good signal works kind of symmetrically, right? If you see a good signal, either you're facing a good type, or you're facing a normal type who's investing. So in either case, whichever type it is, you expect that if you enter, you'll get you expect that there'll be investment, and therefore you should enter. Right? So that's what the short-run players are doing. They're entering on 1, they're staying out on 0, and that makes perfectly good sense. Now, the more interesting thing is actually what to do when there's no signal. What can you infer if there's no signal? This is actually the most complicated calculation, in fact. So you can infer that the previous short-run player didn't enter, right? That's all you know. So, but why didn't the previous short-run player enter? Okay. Well, there's two possible reasons that the previous short-run player didn't enter. One is because they saw the bad signal, right? The other is that that the previous short-run player before that didn't enter either, right? So you go back in time, it's always either 0 and n, 0 and n, 0 and n. So it is, well, if you go back far enough, eventually there had to be a 0 back there somewhere, right? So really what you should infer is that some short-run player saw a bad signal sometime. That's why they're all staying out, starting a chain of staying out, and therefore you should stay out too, because after all, the probability of the type changing is relatively low. Okay, so on a neutral signal, it's kind of not a signal of bad, but it's a signal there was a bad back there somewhere. Okay? So you basically draw the same conclusion and you stay out. That's the short-run player. Okay, questions about the short-run player? Was there a question? Yeah.
Public position of information to get around this.
I'll come to that at the end, actually. That's a very legitimate question, but let's not discuss it in the context. Let me do the model, and then we can talk about the meaning of the model, and that's exactly, yeah. In particular, maybe we could change pi, right? It'd be a good idea, yeah. Okay, so the question came up earlier about where this crazy cutoff for pi came from. Now I'm actually going to answer that question. I'm going to talk about long-run player optimality. Okay, so the question is, when should you invest? Okay, so there's two cases. You're either anticipating entry or you're not anticipating entry. And so the question is, should you invest when entry is anticipated? Okay, and should you invest when entry is not anticipated? It should be clear that if you're going to invest when entry is not anticipated, then you certainly want to enter when entry is anticipated. It can only be better to enter. Sorry, it can only be better to invest when entry is anticipated than not anticipated, right? Because if you invest when entry is anticipated, you expect everybody to know about it. Whereas if you invest when entry is not anticipated, people might not find out about it for a long time. So it's not quite such a good plan to invest, right? So I'm going to look at a slightly modified problem for the long-run player. I'm going to assume that you incur this cost C of investment, and that results in some probability P of establishing a good reputation. So if you're expecting entry P is 1, if you're not expecting entry P is pi. Okay, but I'll just do both cases at once because it's the same calculation. So you pay C, you get a probability P of getting a good reputation. If you get a good reputation, you get 1 minus C forever. Okay? Because 1 is what you get for the entering and C is what so basically you're going to always invest, always have entry. You get 1 for the entry minus C for the investment. So 1 minus C is the good state, always invest, always enter. So you can pay C today and you have probability P of getting 1 minus C in the future. So what is the present value of the gain from investment? I'll call that gamma. So this is an average present value. So current payoffs are weighted by 1 minus delta, and payoffs starting next period are weighted by delta. So you have to pay a cost C today for sure. So you have minus 1 minus delta C today, plus delta times the probability of establishing a good reputation, P. So delta times P. If you get the good reputation, you get 1 minus C forever. If, also with probability delta, but with probability 1 minus P, right? You're back in the same boat. You didn't establish a good reputation, you got to start over again, and so you're going to get exactly the same gamma as you did before. And now we can solve this equation for gamma, and there's the answer to the question of what the interpretation is. This is going to be the gamma. This is going to be one of the critical values of gamma is going to determine what is pi. Okay, so this is just algebra. So we go to the next page. So there's two possibilities. If gamma is negative, it means don't invest. It's a bad idea to invest. If gamma is positive, it means invest. So let's take first the case where P is equal to 1. You're in a good state. You have good reputation. You're anticipating entry. Okay, information is going to be revealed immediately. P is equal to 1. So this condition, when P is equal to 1, this just says that delta less than C. Okay, don't invest when delta is less than C. That's a pretty obvious condition. It just says, even in a good state, right, it's not worth paying C to maintain my reputation because I really don't care about the future all that much. Okay, so and then the interesting case, this is kind of a standard case. You're just too impatient, so you don't do it. So now the question is, there's two possibilities. One is that you're willing to invest when P is equal to 1, but not invest when P is equal to pi. And the other is that you're willing to invest both when P is equal to 1 and when P is equal to pi. Okay, so that should be on the next slide, hopefully. Okay, to invest, so delta bigger than C, then if P is equal to 1, in the good state, you definitely want to maintain your reputation. So you're going to invest in the good state. You're going to invest when Z equals 1. Okay, so now the question is if Z equals 0, if you're in the bad state, or Z equals N, you're in the bad state, one of those two, 0 or N, you're in the bad state, what should you do? So now the probability of getting a reputation is pi. It's no longer equal to 1. So we have to go back to this, delta P times, that's now delta pi times 1 minus C. Oops. So here we have delta pi times 1 minus c. So I rearranged that to put the pi on the other side. Okay, so there's where your critical value of pi comes from. It's the value of pi that makes you indifferent between investing or not investing when you're in the bad state. Okay, that's the specific interpretation. Okay, so if pi is higher than this, then it's worth investing even in the bad state. And if pi is lower than this, it's not worth investing in the bad state, even though it is worth investing in the good state. Okay? All right. Questions so far? So there's these three different kinds. I did the slides differently in the paper, but I decided now I like it better the way I did it in the paper. So I'm going to go back over the slides and say some more things about this. So there's these three different kinds of equilibrium. There's the always stay out equilibrium, and there's the always invest equilibrium. That's what is standard in reputation. There's nothing new in those kinds of equilibrium. Every reputational model has equilibrium. If you're patient enough, you always go for the reputation. If you're impatient enough, you never go for the reputation. That's completely standard. Okay. The case here that is new and is distinctive to this model is the other case. It's the middle case, which I call the reputation trap, case 2. So here, the interest rate's high enough that you're willing to maintain a reputation, but the information is sufficiently bad that you're not willing to acquire a reputation. And this is what gives rise to this strong history dependence, right? Because there's two very different situations. We now have a specific interpretation of adverse and beneficial events. An adverse event is a transition in which a bad type arrives. If a bad type arrives, that bad type is going to do what? They're not going to invest. So even if you have a good reputation to begin with, the bad type's going to ruin it, and you're gone. Okay? And then what? In this situation, with pi is small, once the bad type goes away and you're back to being the normal type again, you as the normal type say, but gosh, I'm stuck with this bad reputation. This guy went before and ruined my reputation. It's just not worth it for me to try to reacquire that reputation. That's the reputation trap. Now it goes the other way. Supposing you get a beneficial event. If you get a beneficial event, you get a type that's going to invest and invest and invest. Now, word doesn't leak out right away, but the types are relatively persistent. So that type, the good type, is going to go on long enough that eventually word is going to leak out that they're doing the good thing. You're going to get your customers back. You have a good reputation. And then when that good type disappears, you're back to be the normal strategic type willing to do whatever, blow in the winds, the CEO that goes for the short-term profits, right? You say, aha, but it's worth it for me to keep this good reputation that was brought to me by the good type. So I have a specific interpretation of adverse and beneficial events. And we also see that it's important the beneficial event lasts long enough that it really be able to restore your reputation. There could be other kinds of beneficial events. There could be beneficial events where not only do they invest, but the word gets out very quickly for some reason. There's some big publicity or something associated with the arrival of this good type. Okay. That's the reputation trap. So this gives rise to the history dependence. I described this before, but I'll describe it again, right? So it's a unique equilibrium. Again, I want to think of case 2. The parameters of case 2 is this unique equilibrium. And in this unique equilibrium, what happens is types evolve over time in a random way. Okay. Sometimes a good type arrives. When they leave, replaced by a normal type, that normal type maintains the good reputation and does very well over the lifetime, and the next normal type, and the next normal type, and the next normal type, until one day a bad type arrives, destroys the reputation, wipes them out, and now the poor normal types are stuck for a long time in this reputation trap until they get good luck, and a good type comes along and restores their reputation. So now we have a theory of where these, if you think of it in terms of these social norms, where these things came from in the first place. It's always mysterious to me, if there's this great stickiness in social norms, and you have this dysfunctional social norm. It was great sometime in the past, but it hung around for hundreds of years after it was no good. How did you ever get the good thing in the first place, right? So this is a theory of how you got the good thing in the first place. You got the good thing in the first place because some beneficial event occurred. And by the way, people that write about this are aware of the idea, and they talk about this. So, for example, in the study of the Italian cities. I'm now forgetting. There's like 5 co-authors. I don't remember. I don't remember. It's probably Bignone et al., but Bignone and Casari and Gambetti at least were 3 of the authors, but I think there were even more than that, right? So they talk about, the events that they talk about is they talk about a war that occurred 400 or 500 years ago. Okay, and these cities faced with a war had to pull themselves together and develop a cooperative social norm in order to defend themselves. Other cities which weren't under threat didn't do this, right? So here we kind of get the beneficial event, which is you're sort of forced to develop this good social norm, and the adverse event. But then I guess if there's no more wars for a long time, then you get sort of stuck in these things, and things, life goes on. Economies develop, and the social norm that was maybe very good when there was no war in the 15th century or 14th century, whatever, maybe it's not so great when it's southern Italy in the 20th century. Okay, that's the idea. And we also have, of course, the opposite thing, which is we could get an adverse event, which kind of wrecks our. So, by the way, there's a lesson here about adverse events. Because I don't know how many people are following current events, probably everybody. So I've noticed 2 adverse events in 2 major countries recently. Okay, one is my own country, the United States. We have a president who is a near pathological liar, whose word, he makes a deal, but you can't trust him to keep his deal, whatever the deal is, right? This is a adverse event for the country of the United States, right? Nobody really wants to do business with Donald Trump. He destroyed his real estate business, right, by lying to everybody and cheating them all, and then he had to go into television instead because nobody would lend him money anymore. And maybe if we're lucky, people believe it's just Donald Trump and not the United States and not the Republican Party, and our reputation won't be permanently destroyed. We'll see, but it looks pretty bad. The even worse event is took place yesterday at this very city, is Brexit. I can't imagine anybody's going to want to do any kind of deal with the UK in the foreseeable future. I mean, gosh almighty, you've got members of parliament saying, if you, the European Union, don't overrule the majority of the House of Commons, we personally are going to attack your European Union and try to make life miserable for you. But beyond that, their inability to reach any decision on anything and the way that they fight with each other, this has to be, I read newspapers from outside the UK and Europe, right? If you read Australian newspapers, right? Nobody's in a rush to do business with people like that. So this is an example of an adverse event. And what I'm saying is the potential, we think of this as not such a big deal maybe, or the British think of it that way. Potentially there's long-run ill consequences from this, right? If foreign investment flees from the UK, and I think you see this in Italy. There's not a lot of foreign investment in Italy because you have to be crazy to invest in Italy, right? But of course, there's a bit of a trap, right? What's the point? So the Italians say, the Italian government always says, come invest, we're really great, right? And then they say, but by the way, we're nationalizing you, or we're doing this to you, or we're doing something else to you, right? So of course, everybody knows this. But of course, the problem is if somebody's stupid enough to come in, there's not much point in treating them well because nobody's really, this is going to seem like an aberration. Nobody's really going to believe it. So it looks to me, it's a bit different across Italy. Milan in the north actually has a pretty good reputation in international circles. I think people are pretty willing to invest in Milan, but I don't see a lot of people being willing to invest in Palermo. Again, it looks like it could very well be a reputation trap in these kinds of places. And so what does Palermo need? It needs a beneficial event, right, to pull them out of it. And what did the UK not need? They had a great reputation, which they just destroyed. And so the theory is saying is beware, because the consequences may go on a lot longer than people anticipate. They want to be like Singapore and Hong Kong, but Singapore and Hong Kong have very good reputations, right? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the theory here, and I want to talk about the role of behavioral types. Because this model is a bit unusual in reputational theory because it has both kinds of behavioral types. So one way to understand the role of behavioral types is to talk about what happens if there are no behavioral types in the first place. So then, if there's no behavioral types, as in any repeated game, the static Nash equilibrium is always in equilibrium, So stay out, never invest, no matter what, is always in equilibrium if there's no behavioral type. So that's always in equilibrium. And then both of the, so if delta is bigger than C, if delta is less than C, that's the only equilibrium, so there's nothing new there. If delta is bigger than C, that remains in equilibrium, but we get additional equilibria, and we get both the type 1 and the type 2 equilibrium. So both the type 2 and the type 3 equilibrium. As we get the equilibrium, always invest, and we also get the equilibrium, invest only on a good signal and don't invest on a bad signal. Those are both equilibria as soon as delta is bigger than C, if there are no behavioral types. Okay. Why is always invest in equilibrium? Because if everybody knows that the normal type's investing on a good signal, then the short-run player seeing a good signal will enter, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay. So the presence. So what is it that these different types accomplish by adding them to the model? What does putting the good type do? So this is where it differs. This is where it's like the gang of 4, but not like nailed to the Samuelson. What the good type does is it gets rid of the bad equilibrium when delta is bigger than C. So if delta is bigger than C, the static Nash equilibrium, never enter, never invest, can't be in equilibrium anymore, because the only reason there could be a good signal is because there's a good type. And so therefore, the long-run player, who's a normal long-run player, says, aha, I should invest because therefore I will get a good signal and I'll be known as a good type and life will be good. Okay, so that gets rid of the bad equilibrium. Okay, what do the bad types do? It's the bad types that distinguish between the other two equilibria. So one it's on the next slide, sorry. Okay. The first thing is, one of the things that types do is it ensures that everything happens in equilibrium. We get all the signals, so there's no zero probability. So it adds an element of subgame perfection or trembling hand perfection. Okay, but in case 2 is the intermediate case. The always invest equilibrium is not subgame perfect. Okay, it is an equilibrium, but it's not subgame perfect. It's a Nash equilibrium. So the good type actually eliminates the non-subgame perfect equilibrium. Now in case 3, neither of the equilibria are actually subgame perfect, so the good type's not going to do anything there. What the good type does do, why is it that you should not choose to non-invest on a bad signal, right, in case 3? It's because the presence of a bad type means you can do the Mailer-Samuelson, you can prove you're not a bad type by investing. Okay, so you want to invest if you're a good type on a bad signal. All right, so the two different behavioral types play an asymmetrical role. The good type gets rid of the bottom equilibrium, and the bad type distinguishes between the two good equilibrium. That's what gives uniqueness. Okay, come back to the beginning. The uniqueness is uniqueness of pure strategy equilibrium. There could be mixed strategy equilibrium. I just want to say something briefly about mixed strategy equilibrium. Okay, what do I want to say about mixed strategy equilibrium? First of all, I want to say this. There is one case where there are none, okay, and that is if the probability of the normal type is very low.
Sorry.
Yep.
Mixed strategy equilibrium when you still have the assumption that everybody has the same strategy.
Yes. So I'm maintaining the common strategy assumption, but I had two assumptions. One was common strategy. The other is the short-run player cannot mix.
Is this to some extent equivalent?
No. Because I'm now going to use the assumption. I'm going to use one assumption but not the other. So I'm going to keep the assumption of common strategy, but I'm going to drop the assumption for the moment that the short-run player can't mix. Now, in one case, if the probability of the normal type is very low, then there cannot be a mixed strategy equilibrium. Why is that? Well, because if there's basically no probability of the normal type, then whatever signal is being generated is generated by one of the behavioral types anyway. So that pins down the strategy of the short-run player. If you see a good signal, it must be because it's a good type. There are no normal types, basically. If you see a bad signal, it must be a bad type. There basically are no normal types. If you see a neutral signal, it must be a bad type, because again, there basically are no normal types, right? So in that case, we can actually rule out there's genuinely unique equilibrium. Now, the only problem with that is the case where probably the normal type is very low is the least interesting case, right? But generally speaking, we're in a case where probably the normal type is quite large and the probability of the behavioral types is quite small. What can go wrong in that case? What can go wrong in that case is if you go back to the game without the types, there are mixed strategy equilibria where the short-run player mixes. When the short-run player mixes, it creates the only way. Either one player mixes, either both players mix or neither mix, right? If one player plays a pure strategy, it pretty much forces the other player. So the short-run player is mixing. The only way the short-run player can be mixing is because the long-run player is mixing enough to make the short-run player indifferent. It's the mixing of the long-run player that matters. What happens if the normal type of long-run player is mixing and there's a high probability of the normal type? The problem is this. When you see a bad signal, you don't get much information out of it. Why not? Because the long-run player has a probability of doing both things. He could have invested or not invested, so you probably aren't seeing a behavioral type if you see a bad signal. You're probably seeing a normal type who's mixing. This destroys the inferential process that underlies reputational equilibrium. It's like signal jamming in a cheap talk game, right? It's basically the long-run player is creating so much noise through his mixing that the short-run player was unable to draw the inferences which drives reputational theory. Now, why isn't this a problem in standard reputational models? So this is a limited memory model. The short-run player only remembers one period. If the short-run player had longer memory, then it would be a lot easier to distinguish a behavioral type from a long-run player who's mixing, right? Because the long-run player who's mixing goes up, down, blah, 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 blah. Right? Whereas a behavioral type is doing the same thing all the time. So if you see a long chain of something happen in a row, that means it's much more likely to have come from a behavioral type than from a normal type that's mixing. So if we extended the memory, it would help with the mixed strategy equilibria. Unfortunately, it would also make the whole analysis of the ergodic distribution really difficult. So can't say I know what happens in that case. But I just want to clarify a little bit what the role of mixed strategies is. Okay. How to get out. Okay. So let's say southern Italy, for the sake of argument, is caught in a reputation trap. What might the central government of Italy or, say, the European Union do to get them out of that trap? Obvious thing to do is to subsidize the cost of investment. If you lower C, then that changes the famous threshold, right? So it'd be more likely they'll be in the always invest equilibrium, they'll get themselves out of the reputation trap. So it works. I mean, if you subsidize C, indeed, it will get them out of the reputation trap. The problem with this is they had the option of getting themselves out of the reputation trap already. They had a C, they had a pi, and they said it wasn't worth it. What that means is, if instead of subsidizing C by giving them some money to invest, you just gave them the money, they would choose not to invest, right? And they would be better off. So from a welfare point of view, it's not a very good idea. If you want to get them out of a reputation trap, great, that works. But of course, it's inefficient because it costs more to get them out of the reputation trap than it's worth to get them out of the reputation trap. That's the whole problem. Okay, so that's maybe not such a good idea. But of course, that is what everybody does. Okay, when they say there's some part of the country, it's impacted, what do? We subsidize investment there. If it's a reputation trap, yeah, it might work, but it probably costs more than it's worth. So there's another way to do it, and that is by manipulating pi by race cars. Formula One races. Okay, so this is just something that struck me in thinking about this. I'm not sure how realistic it is. But what you want to do is you want to reduce pi. You want information to get out more quickly about whether there's a good culture or not. Well, one way of doing that is figuring out some way of getting people to come and look, right? Okay, if people show up, and this seems to be part of the thinking that underlies cities that bid on large sporting events. Why do they pay a lot of money for Formula One race? Why do they want the Olympics? Why do they want the World Cup soccer? Why do places bid like crazy on these sporting events? Because it does attract massive numbers of outside people. And if you had this really bad culture and you want to change your culture and make it good and prove to everybody that it's good, so after you improve your culture, you bid on the Olympics, everybody comes and says, that's great. Now, the problem is for that to work, you have to actually change your culture before people come and look. right? So unfortunately, we see a couple of examples where they did it, but they didn't actually change the culture. So so they had the Olympics in Greece, and they wanted everybody to see how great Greece was, and then they kind of messed up the construction of the Olympics. In Brazil, all the Olympic athletes were being robbed, the bathrooms didn't work, and so forth. Sort of kind of confirmed what everybody already thought about those places anyway. So it was a bit counterproductive that way. I was trying to think if any of these events have ever had a positive effect. I have possible examples. I think maybe the Olympics in Barcelona in 1992 and maybe the World Exposition in Chicago in 1893 may be examples of places where there was actually a beneficial event, where there was potentially a good reputation to be had, but it wasn't well known. By attracting people to these locations, it became better known. There's not a lot of empirical work done on this, so I can't really say for sure. But at least in thinking about examples, those are the ones that came to mind. So that's actually, I believe, the last slide. It is. So I'll take questions, and then when we're done with questions, I'll talk about young economists.
Yeah, David, the big question. What about Argentina? Okay, so here's a country, terrible reputation for a really long time, like since it started.
No, that's not true. At the turn of the 20th century, actually had a pretty good reputation.
No, I can tell you a story. Like in 1810,
Yeah.
okay, they decided they would copy the U.S. They took on all of our institutions, okay, and in monetary policy, was something I know about, they set up a central bank, okay, modeled after the Bank of England. They, it was based on the gold standard. They borrowed the reserves from the British. Okay, they set up a sinking fund. They did everything Alexander Hamilton did.
Yeah.
Okay, within 5 years, they looted the sinking fund. They printed a lot of money. Okay, they defaulted on the check. Okay, that was 1810. Okay, and if you look at their history, ever since they've gone through like this. Okay, but here you've got a country with lots of resources. Okay,
Yeah.
so it is a place that it's a good climate, etc. So it hasn't not grown. It hasn't totally collapsed, but it really hasn't grown as much as it could. So they have been in this trap forever.
Yeah, it's complicated by the natural resource fact, right? Because as I say, at the beginning of the 20th century, the per capita GDP in Argentina was not dissimilar from the United States.
Right.
I don't know exactly how it tracked before that. We know after that, particularly coming out of the Great Depression, it started falling very, very badly behind. I think part of it, moreover, the recent Argentinian crisis was solved by the increase in soybean prices. So, their dependence on commodities goes back a long way. But one of the things that's not perhaps it is in the smallest sense, because if C is high, then you're much more inclined to get stuck in a reputational trap. And one interpretation of C being high is that C is the opportunity cost of investing in reputation. So if you're a commodity-based economy, right, you're not doing much stuff that involves foreign investment, then the opportunity cost of trying to do foreign investment stuff is relatively high compared to a country like Singapore, where there is no commodity at all, right? And either there's nothing else to put the money into, basically, right? Either you pay it, you do business with foreigners, or you starve. Whereas Argentina is quite different in that respect. That would be my best explanation.
Right. If you look at your colleague Sebastian Edwards, so what he showed for Argentina and all these countries is they have this
right.
stop-go cycle for their entire history. He runs a line through it. Okay, and he finds, compared to other countries, we'll call good countries, we'll say advanced countries, so the growth rate for those countries is a lot lower. So even though you got these huge investment booms, everyone says, wow, let's go into Argentina like they did in 1990 after the convertibility plan. They go in, lots of investment comes in. Then you get the crisis in 2002, everybody leaves.
Right, well, you seem to be posing a different puzzle, which is how do you get a cycle where people come in and get screwed and then leave again? So the most likely explanation is they didn't really get screwed. They probably took enough money up front that they profited. But anyway, so I don't want to propose this model as the answer to all questions in development for starters. I want to point out it might be a factor in particular cases. It could conceivably be a factor in Argentina, but I admit, while I know something of Argentina, I don't know as much as you, and certainly not as much as Sebastian. So I'll leave aside. The countries I thought of more, which are countries like Italy, I think there is some reason to think it might be playing a role, but I'm not so sure about Argentina. Okay. Big or little questions? Yeah.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
And I should say that I don't actually work on game theory, so I don't know if this makes sense. But so in terms of kind of getting out of the trap, why wouldn't it work if instead of providing? So I think the one solution was subsidizing the cost, but the first solution was subsidizing the cost of investment for the seller side. But why couldn't you kind of do some type of subsidy for the consumer side? So in the sense of
I see.
maybe if I provide some insurance.
Yeah. Okay. That you're right. That is a distinctive. So I talked about of lowering pi. And in a sense, that's what I had in mind. But what you're talking about is a little bit distinct from that, in fact. And I agree. So this is an obvious thing, for example, for a business. If you have a bad reputation, you pay people to come. And that definitely is something possible to do. I was thinking of events like the Olympics as somewhat along the lines of paying people to come. It's not entirely... So the issue is, could you get a better cost-benefit ratio from subsidizing foreign investors rather than from subsidizing, say, that's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to it, and it's quite possible that would be a better strategy, and that is also a common strategy, and I agree, it seems potentially could be a good one. You said you had a second question.
I have a second question, which is just kind of thinking about reputation in general. Because so far, I feel like we've thought about it in terms of like a single dimension, but I guess from a firm side, kind of, you could say maybe, I have a reputation about the quality of my product, I have a reputation about customer service, and then, so if I think of kind of reputation as kind of having multiple dimensions, is it easy to kind of just extend this model kind of in an n-dimensional way, and then, or it just gets more complicated?
I know the answer to that question. There's a reason we do it this way, because we don't actually know how to do the other one. There's really not much more to it than that. No, it's not that nobody thinks that the multidimensional issues aren't interesting, but the multidimensional issues are extremely difficult.
Thank you.
Was there another hand over there, or? Yeah.
So I'm not a game theory expert, but what I found very interesting is the question, what determines if I start at a low or a higher level of reputation? So is it all about self-fulfilling prophecy? So is it really ability? So you did not talk about ability and expectations. So for example, if I'm a black disabled woman, I might start at a very different level of expectation, although my ability is good. And so when we come to the question you were raising in the end, I think this is very important when we look about, how could we maybe try to get over this reputation trap, to really think about the causes for this trap. Because in the end, if we think about the examples, those are all strong signals. So we do the Olympics, people look at us, they consider us to be a good country, a cool city or whatever. But if everybody does this, then my signal is not worth it anymore. Because everybody could do this kind of signaling. And then my signal is just relative. So maybe what do we learn about the source of reputation?
All right, so let me separate that question into two parts, because I think there's two parts of it. So one had to do with what the origin of reputation is, and the other had to do with what if everybody did it. Let me answer the second one first, because at least from my point of view, that seems a bit easier. There's really no reason everybody can't have a good reputation. That is, the point is, if we're talking about high-quality products, right, it's great if all firms produce high-quality products. There's nothing wrong with that, and then we buy, right, what we want to avoid, there's not really an upper bound on how many non-cheating firms we want to have in the economy, I don't think. right? So it's not like my firm not cheating hurts your firm particularly, right? We can both not cheat, we can both do good business because we're producing different products. So that's what I would mostly say about that. I don't think, it's not a zero-sum game that if a city in Nigeria becomes rich, a city in China has to become poor. They could actually both be rich. Okay, so that's one half. The other half had to do with the antecedent. And in the sense the model, it either doesn't answer the question or provides a funny answer to the question, depending on how you want to think about it. The time has no beginning in this model, so it's not possible to say, we started here and this is what was originally true. On the other hand, if we look at a particular point in time, we can run the model back in time to see what it was that led us to the current circumstances. Right? So you say, how did we get to where we are? That question can be answered by the model. And the answers given to the model is, in some sense, it's the luck of the draw. If you're in a good situation here, it's because the last time something happened in the past, you had good luck. And if you're in a bad circumstance here, it's because the last time something happened long ago, you had bad luck. Right? So it attributes in a real sense to luck, because it is just luck. Right? And I know that's not maybe a very deeply satisfying answer, but that seems like the part that we can do the least about, right? So that, once you're in the trap, we can think about how to get out of it. But it's a little hard to see how we can prevent. I mean, one thing, of course, is to try to prevent adverse events from happening, right? So you don't get into the trap in the first place. But that's not very helpful once you're there, obviously.
Excuse me. I'm not sure we have time for more questions because the time is running and we still have to give the address and advice to the young economists. So, but Professor Levine is here today or tomorrow, so feel free to talk, and I'm happy that we have a lot of questions and a very fruitful discussion.
Okay. So I'm supposed to talk now about careers. Okay, so I had, so I thought a lot. There's lots of things I could talk about. I talk about, what are the best journals to submit your papers to, or should you take a postdoc rather than get an assistant professorship? But I think what I want to talk about is love and collaboration. So not love in the sense of loving other people, but love in the sense of loving the subject. So I think that one thing that successful economists have in common is that they love economics and they're infinitely curious about economic questions. I think that's probably true of many of the people here. If it isn't true of you, I would actually have you give some thought to whether the academic career is the right career for you, because it's not by any means the most lucrative career for a PhD economist. You can make much better money by going into the private sector. And it's actually very hard to produce consistent, good quality research over a period of time unless you really love what you're doing. But if you love what you're doing, the question then is how to do it well. And that's where I would talk about collaboration. I look back, if you were to look at my vita, you discover that there's some names that appear over and over again that aren't my name. You'd find the name, two names you'd find in particular would be Drew Fudenberg and Tim Keogh, both of whom I met when I was in graduate school. More recently, you'll find McKelly Baldrine, who I met when I was somewhat out of graduate school, but somewhat later. These are people that have been lifetime collaborators for me. If you look at my vita, you won't find a lot of papers that are not co-authored papers. I think if you look at Drew Fudenberg's vita, you'll find even fewer. And why is collaboration important? Not so much, I think, for the sharing of the writing of a paper. At least in my experience, it's not so uncommon, especially if there's 3 or more authors. One person winds up doing a relatively large amount of the writing. Maybe there's some specialization. One person proves more of the theorems, one person does more of the writing. To me, that's not the value of collaboration. To me, the value of collaboration is not necessarily a formal collaboration. I get huge benefit from people that aren't my co-authors as well. So when I was, I was very fortunate in graduate school. I was surrounded by a very good group of people. I spent hours at lunch. It was the freshwater economists against the saltwater economists amongst the graduate students. I and Bruce Smith and Paul Romer were the freshwater economists, and the other guys from Yale and all the other places were the saltwater economists. And we would debate every day at lunch everything about economics. What's the right way to do economics? What are the right economic questions? To me, the benefit of collaboration is in identifying interesting and tractable questions, things that need to be done that can be done. Right? I think the hardest thing in many ways right? And sitting down and writing a paper is knowing what to write a paper about. Is this really an important thing? If, you know, I ask as an advisor, what is the question that students most commonly come to me with? Should I work on this or shouldn't I work on this? I'm sorry to say that my answer to that question is almost always, I'm not really sure. Because it's actually very hard to tell. It's actually very hard to tell. Sometimes you have to go down a ways down the road to see what's there. Sometimes there's something, this is perhaps another message I would give you. Don't be afraid to go down a road. And don't be afraid to turn back. You know, I've written a lot of papers. I've thrown out more papers than I've written. Sometimes I've thrown out papers and come back to them years later and it turned into something. Other times, they've never returned, right? But you can't really tell whether there's something there or not until you go far enough down the road to see. Sometimes you say, this is an interesting theory, but maybe it doesn't really tell us anything interesting about the world. And you go down the road and you discover, actually there was something really interesting there. There was something I wasn't anticipating. Other times you go down the road and say, this is actually pretty boring. Everybody would have guessed that this was true in the first place. I'm not going to make a big thing out of telling everybody something they already knew. Collaboration is really critical in this. I know that people go to their advisors and look to senior people and mentors and so forth. I must say that was a lot less common when I was a young economist. I would say that debating it among yourselves, you know, that you guys are the future of economics after all. Debating among yourselves is the crucial thing. If you can convince your peers that it's interesting, if you can convince your peers to work on it with you or that you should work on it, that's a lot more important than convincing me that you should work on it. That would be my message. That would be my message to you. I think the other message is, you know, be curious. If there was one thing I would complain about most in presentations or papers, particularly by students, but even by young economists, is I'm not sure that people always look as deeply into the flaws or limitations of their models as they should. I know as far as proofs go, you know, the most likely person to ever find a mistake in your proof is you. It's actually very difficult to find a mistake in other people's proofs. You know, reading it line by line sometimes generates an anomaly. Or if you suspect the result might be wrong, you go looking for it and you might find an anomaly. But be skeptical. Be skeptical of what you're doing. And ask, does this really interest? Does this really make sense? You know, at the end of the day, right, you're going to be successful not by writing a lot of papers and not by writing poor papers. You're going to be known by your best papers. And the way you're going to have good papers is if you throw away the stuff that isn't any good, or not necessarily throw it away. Don't promote it. If you try to promote stuff to more than it is, that's not what builds your reputation, right? And you know, if you challenge your own research, I don't know that I'm great at this or perfect at this, but I must say I spent a lot of time sitting around thinking, does this result really make sense? Is this result really interesting? Is this result correct even? Okay. You know, do I really feel satisfied by this, or do I think that this is something that should be transparent to everyone, or maybe it's wrong. I don't really believe it fits with the evidence or the data or empirical studies, right? Challenge yourself that way. More important, it's hard to challenge yourself that way. Collaborate with other people who will challenge you that way, and you challenge them that way, right? So I could talk endlessly about sort of technical things to do for your career, but at the end of the day, I think these things are a lot less important than really going out and really trying to do first-rate research. And I really do believe that the way to do that, right, is for you to work with your peers and against your peers and confront your peers and argue with your peers and debate with your peers. What's a good problem? Is this interesting? What should we work on, right? And that's one of the reasons why I said at the beginning, I'm very enthusiastic about this conference and very grateful to the people that organized it, because one of the ways in which you find co-authors, one of the places where you debate people about ideas is much more so at conferences. We all go around, we give talks, and we meet people and so forth and so on. That's interesting and so forth. But it's often really at conferences that the real action takes place. So it's good that you're here. And now that you're here, take advantage of it. That is my advice. And thank you. Okay, we can, or get a gift even. Yes.
course. We wouldn't let you out without the gift.
Wait, but let me not destroy the microphone.
Okay, yeah, that would be important, I would say.
This is fastened to me.
Perfect.
So, thank you. We have a coffee break now in the R42 building. Just follow these guys. They are heading there normally.
So we're heading to the other venue, is that correct?
Yes.